Hello, everyone, and welcome to MICE, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo. I'm your host, Shelley Paroline, and this panel is called Remembering John Lewis Through March. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to thank our co-presenter for this program, WBUR City Space at the Levine Broadcast Center. City Space is a state-of-the-art multimedia venue located at Boston University's campus that brings the stories you hear every day from WBUR and NPR to life by hosting readings, interviews, debates, panels, podcasts, performances, story slams, comedy book clubs, and conversations like we're having tonight. And thanks to all of our arts advocates. These are major contributors who help sustain MICE and allow the show to grow year after year. MICE is produced by the Boston Comics Arts Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization that funds comic arts festivals, individual artists, educational programs for the greater Boston community. If you like what we're doing here, please consider making a donation today using the donate button at the bottom of this session. Also at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a button labeled Ask a Question. Please use that button to ask or vote up any questions you may have throughout the session. Also feel free to use the chat feature and say hello right now. Finally, we'll be streaming this panel to our Facebook page, facebook.com/MICEXPO, for audience members who would like to use the automatic closed caption function that Facebook Live offers. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator. After getting a start in public radio in Florida, Quincy Walters is now a local reporter for WBUR, where he covers topics like the environment and identity. His work has received many awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Florida AP Broadcaster Association, Public Radio News Directors Incorporated, and the Radio Television Digital News Association. Thank you, Quincy. Please take it away.
Thank you, Shelley. And I guess I'll just start off by saying 2020 has been a heck of a year that none of us, it seems, will get out unscathed. And in 2020, we also lost Representative John Lewis. And my guests who wrote the March trilogy with Representative Lewis are here. And I guess I would just have them start by introducing themselves and sort of how you all felt when you heard the news this summer. I guess Andrew, we could start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Quincy. It's good to be with you. I worked for Congressman Lewis for more than 13 years. I served in his congressional office. I served on his campaigns. And I convinced him to do the March graphic novels. And so when I got the news that he'd passed away, obviously I was sad. I think in some ways I felt a little bit of peace in knowing that he'd seen everything that was happening this spring and early summer with so many young people rising up and coming together and organizing and mobilizing. But it wasn't just losing a boss. It wasn't just losing somebody that everybody else saw on TV or saw as an icon. John Lewis was my friend, and I miss the strangest things. You wouldn't understand it in some ways, but I miss going to auction houses with him. I miss going to pick out ties. I miss that late night phone call with some hot gossip. So yeah, it's good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And Nate, I guess we can go to you now.
Thanks for having me. So I'm Nate. I'm the artist of March, and I had known Congressman Lewis since 2011 and met him in person and developed a friendship as well as a creative relationship since 2012. The last time I got a chance to be physically together in the same space as Congressman Lewis was December 1st of last year. It was the last big March event that we all did together. And so since his diagnosis at the end of last year, I sort of shifted a lot of my priorities in our dynamic over and tried to be as much of just a plain friend as I possibly could. And so kind of really tried to step up to the responsibilities that any friend has for another. So a lot of that is staying on the phone every week, trying to trying to be an ear, trying to stay as big on small talk as I tend to be, and as I know Congressman Lewis can be as well. I think that was a lot of comfort for both of us. I think the last time we spoke was about 3 or 4 weeks before he passed away. It's been a strange experience this year, especially in the context of the pandemic and in the context of everything that means with so much separation and sort of the loss of this larger public social grieving process for millions of people in America who have lost loved ones. So I was here with my family when we got the news that he had passed away. My wife gave me the news because she stays up later than me, and I had already gone to sleep that night. And frankly, it took about a month or so before a lot of the reality of his passing and a lot of the reality of the loss really hit me. And a lot of that, I think, is that mix of that private, intense personal grieving and being a part of this bigger public grieving. So a lot of it, I just kind of converted a lot of my energy over to my kids and contextualizing everything for my kids, and let the more personal aspects hit me whenever the time is appropriate.
Right, that's so understandable. It seems that in a year where like time and space to grieve is needed, it seems that there's very little space and time to do that. And our other panelist is Joel. If you could just introduce yourself, Joel, and how you mentioned that you were sort of you saw March and sort of before it was published, and you've also met Congressman Lewis a few times. If you could just talk about how you were feeling over the summer when you heard about his passing.
Like, I hate 2020, like would not recommend, 0 stars. That's kind of how I felt about the entire thing. Like, I met Nate and Andrew before I met the congressman, and Andrew introduced me to the congressman at SPX, and I've met a lot of famous people over the course of my career. And some people I can text, like I know famous people that I can text. And I think John Lewis was the first person I was afraid to go and talk to. And it's weird because like he was a nice, sweet guy. Like, like he reminds me a lot of my brother. Like, I have an older brother. He reminds me a lot of my older brother. And there was no reason, like, there's nothing to be intimidated by, but like, this is a man who has a scar on his head so that I can vote. You know what I mean? So and I didn't know, like I didn't know, I can't say that I knew him. I met him multiple times. I think he recognized me the last time I saw him because I saw him here in New Hampshire when he was, and Andrew was like the first time that I was going to see them both in New Hampshire, and Andrew was off doing something else, being a big deal. And, and he said to me, he was like, Andrew's down in Georgia right now, like, I can't say that I knew him, but I felt like I knew him after seeing him and meeting him and talking to him a number of times. And it's difficult, right? Like, like how often do you get to meet people who you read about in history books? And I'm drawing comics too. So like, I'm drawing comics about Black history, and like, here is living, breathing, walking Black history. Like, I think this is when it becomes really important for us to make sure we get the people that are important in the world, and to be able to tell those people while they're still, give them flowers while they're still alive. Don't wait until people are gone, because you just don't know what's going to happen. You never know when you won't see that person again, when that person will be the last time you see him. So it was more emotional than I thought it would be, because like I said, I didn't really know him, but he did stuff for me.
Right. And I sort of want to go back to that imagery, Joel, of Congressman Lewis at sort of the convention. I mean, what was that moment like for you, seeing a civil rights hero kind of juxtaposed with maybe comic book heroes at a convention?
Oh, that was just dope. Like, I mean, like, there's just nothing else to say. Like, everybody else is cosplaying of superheroes, and like, you've got probably like 2 rows away from him, there's Rick and Morty. Like there's like this is like people who are like just imaginary. And this is like somebody who actually stood in the face of something like a real, like this is real, right? That's a completely different thing. And I think that seeing this, remember seeing it and just thinking how like just that was just 100% amazing. Like there's nothing there's no like daylight between this and dopeness. Like there's just none. It's just it exists at the same place.
Right. And I guess this question is for Andrew, but it's more of sort of an observation and then a question. But when I was sort of started reading the March trilogy a few days ago, it kind of made sense to me that John Lewis's story could be turned into sort of a comic book, because he is objectively sort of an American hero, right? And reading the book, we have him on this farm in Alabama, and he sort of develops his sort of sense of morality. He has an origin story, right? There are numerous villains in his life. He has relatives who sort of try to dissuade him from his, heroic journey. And then you have sort of relatives in his life we see in the comics that sort of encourage him on that path. But Wikipedia says it wasn't sort of based on his life paralleling a classic comic superhero. And so, Andrew, I guess, how did that idea come about to tell John Lewis's story in comic form?
Well, first off, I guess we all have to take Wikipedia with a grain of salt sometimes. It's actually been interesting to me as things have gone along with March, because someone will write an article about the history of March or something like that, and they'll use an interview that Nate or I gave, and we didn't answer a question a particular way at that moment. They'll say, that's the answer that you gave, and that's the only answer you ever gave, and that's how the story went. And it's been, like, you gotta remember that first couple of years, I was so scared to be like standing next to John Lewis giving interviews. Like I was a staffer, right? And the first rule of being a good staffer is to you're seen, not heard. So speaking was just giving, like talking to reporters was crazy. But that's actually, it started in 2008. It was a summer of hope and change. Barack Obama was sweeping through the Democratic primaries. And we were facing in the congressman's office this real question of like, how do you tell young people what he'd done? Because one of the backlashes to the Clinton endorsement in 2008 was that there's a lot of questioning of like, is he relevant? What has he done in Congress? And also highlighting of the fact that so many people didn't know who he was or what he had done during the movement. And so when he told me about Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story on that campaign, which he told me about because people were making fun of me for going to a comic book convention, I remember thinking like, why is there not a John Lewis comic? Because I grew up in Atlanta. Congressman was my congressman since I was 3 years old, and yet growing up in Atlanta, going to Atlanta public schools, and going to the King Center any number of times as a kid, nobody had in that whole time, nobody had told me the story of SNCC and what the young people were able to do. And on that campaign, that first campaign I worked for him on, I heard these stories firsthand. You're staffing him every day. You're listening to him talk to kids, talk to adults, and he's telling these intimate, personal moments that nobody had taught me as a kid. But I think, and then that's where I had the idea and talked him into it, and it took some pushing and all that. But I think what your question is getting at is like, it's Star Wars, right? It's like Black Star Wars, right? He grows up on a farm. He goes to meet the powerful wizard who teaches him the new way where he can understand his power over the world. And then he uses that to overcome evil and defeat the Death Star on the Capitol steps in Nashville, right? I think Nate and I, especially once we realized it was a trilogy, that was very much on our mind. And it's crazy because it's not something you set out to be like, oh, hey, look, it's John Lewis Skywalker. Like you're not thinking that when you approach the story. The idea was that a comic was used to inspire civil disobedience so we could do it again. But when you get into the mechanics of how you tell that story and following a narrative that's simply true, all of a sudden you realize when you break it up at certain points, you realize that the hero narrative is universal because that's how people become heroes. And that's how John Lewis became a hero. And if we can only see nonviolence, civil disobedience, and the power of organizing as a superpower, as a vehicle for the creation of power, then we've achieved our goal, and society will change, and that's why it worked as a story.
Unmute. And so the book starts off with that iconic bridge scene, and I'm wondering, I guess, Nate, for you, what was unique about illustrating the March trilogy that you might not have encountered with your previous work?
Well, going into drawing March, I'd say I had no awareness of just how many assumptions I had as a cartoonist, as a Southern white boy, taught taught civil rights history by my white middle class baby boomer Mississippian parents. Like, I had multiple sets of luggage and baggage that I was sort of bringing into the work, and I in a lot of ways, like, I'd spent the previous 5 or 6 years reading and working and learning and applying some of what I learned into shorter works and a previous autobiographical graphic novel that someone else wrote that I drew. And all this served sort of as a boot camp, which ultimately allowed me to kind of hit the ground running with March. But fundamentally, I really wasn't aware of how deeply I had sort of accepted the hierarchical view, the sort of more popularly accepted top-down change model that is generally accepted as historically accurate in terms of the civil rights movement. Which that's related to what the Southern Poverty Law Center would call the 9-word problem, meaning that most kids in America graduate from high school knowing 9 words about the movement, being Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. And so, a lot of it had to do with day by day, week by week, recognizing how many crucial historical figures had been kind of swept, into the shadows or under the rug. A lot of them due to being women or being gay, and a lot of folks for being teenagers or for being young adults. And recognizing that John Lewis's perspective as a former young person at the center of the movement remained true. And his focus from the get-go was in shedding light on the importance of the decentralized nature of organizing and leadership within SNCC and within the younger people's wing of the movement. And a lot of stuff that just kind of, like every day, every week was sort of a series of new revelations, even while I was at the drawing table working on it day after day. So in a lot of aspects, a lot of it was like getting to go back to school on the drawing table to relearn the history of the movement itself. And it was powerfully transforming. And as a parent, that was being applied, week by week in terms of my growing relationship with my kid. It was transformative on every level. I have never been the same since starting March, and I will never be the same.
And Nate, I guess speaking about, being transformative for you, and this question goes for our other panelists too, are there parts in the book or moments in the book that sort of that are your favorite parts, that sort of make you think like, oh yeah, this part definitely resonates with me, or resonates, with this time that we're experiencing in America?
Oh,
When I
go for it,
yeah.
Joel.
So I'm just gonna say, like, just when don't mean to talk over you, Nate, but like I just want to say, like I was a fan of Nate before I met him. So I was always a fan, and I met Andrew probably the year before March came out at SPX, and he gave me the blad that came out. I remember, I still have it, it's somewhere over here. But when, not even thinking about how big this book was going to be. And when they came back the next year and March came out, I remember getting it. I got it signed. I met, nervously met John Lewis. And then I got in line and got my book signed, and I was opening it up. And like I said, I've always been a fan of Nate's, and I come to this page specifically, and I'm like at SPX getting ready to go sell my book, Strange Fruit. And I'm like sitting I like open this page up and immediately start to cry, like close this book up. I'll read this later when I'm in my hotel room, because it was just, that's a thing that's like, I don't think, it's hard to explain to people. And I'm sure there are people that understand this, but it's hard to explain the idea of someone, like I seem like I post this every couple of weeks on social media, but it's like, it's hard to explain to people that you should care about other people. And it's clear to me that from the work that Congressman Lewis did, that he cared about other people. He didn't just go home. I mean, because he could have he'd done thing, right? In the 1960s, he was part of that movement. He could have done his thing and just went off into the sunset, and people would have called him on CNN and talked to him about stuff on a regular basis and paid him to come and speak. He could have done that, but no, like he was getting arrested, 3 or 4 years ago, he's getting arrested for protesting. You know what I mean? Like he was still doing that stuff. And so like this picture, I think this image, Nate did such an amazing job of just capturing that moment. That's like, here I am still, like he's still grasping at something, right? And that's what he was doing. Like when he visited Black Lives Matter Plaza, he was still grasping at that same thing.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess Nate, this is your image, but are there, other moments in March that happened that you've illustrated that sort of, resonate with you, or, have power with you?
I'd say the key moments that really struck me throughout, a lot of it had to do with before I was drawing the book. The very first thing I did to sort of get myself up to speed was to read Walking with the Wind at the time for the first time in 2011. I think I was flying somewhere, and during takeoff, I was like, well, time to crack this memoir open. And by the time the plane was in the air, I was just like openly weeping just from the self-titled, the eponymous Walking with the Wind intro. And I recognized that the intensity and the gravity with which John Lewis experienced the world, even as like a 6-year-old kid, was something that I immediately identified with. And when I was 6, I lived about 47 miles from where he was living when he was 6. He lived just off the old Troy Highway. Outside of Troy, and I lived at the end of the old Troy Highway, and I used to play in this ditch featured in the book Any Empire, about a quarter mile. So, I mean, it's relevant though. It's like the landscapes come up throughout the trilogy, and it's the same land. It's literally the same topography, and so I started feeling linked to a lot of these sensory experiences, and linked to this subjective view that he had crystallized from this very young age. So like, yeah, there are these moments like even getting into The Boy Preacher, just like really getting lost in the subjective gravity of what it meant to be practicing his preaching skills to his flock of chickens, was so meaningful to me. And sort of moving throughout it, like my favorite sequence in the book is as a cartoonist, like, there's a lot of real tough material in here. And so it's like, it's hard to say this in a certain way without sounding callous, but like as a cartoonist, one of my favorite sequences is in 1964, as John Lewis is working as a part of search parties to look for the 3 missing civil rights workers in Mississippi. There's a 2-page sequence where he's moving in the middle of the night. There's a mosquito that lands on the back of his neck. He smacks it, and the search is turning out to be increasingly fruitless. But as he's looking at this bloodied mosquito on his palm, and people are asking if he had found anything, and then just this blank page with the flashlight on the ground where he says no. That these are like the reasons why I love making comics, and the reasons why this project has always meant so much to me, is the ability to take incredibly intimate subjective moments like that and give them the kind of resonance that the history surrounding these moments has.
Well, and that's such a fantastic example of the power of a graphic novel versus any other medium in telling the story, right? Because the mosquito story was something that we added in just from an offhanded story that he told. It's not in a book, it's not anywhere else. And if you tell the story in a prose book of John Lewis swatting a mosquito and being sad, like that doesn't convey what those images that Nate did bring across to the reader. And
That's
and
like,
I'm supposed to go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, like, that's just like what comics do, like what you said, Andrew, is it perfect. Like comics, the writing prose and writing comics, there's this dance that the words and the pictures have to do, and you don't necessarily have to, like, that's the thing. It becomes a really dry, straightforward statement. John Lewis smacks a mosquito and he was sad. But when Nate takes that and interprets that whole thing, it's like it's the entire moment. It's just not that line of sentence. You're like taking the page, which is a unit of time, and you're stretching that out, and you're showing this in such a way that it gets Willem Warringer said this thing once about empathy in art, and it says that in order for art to have some kind of meaning to people, there has to be something that you feel in it. You have to see that and you have to feel something. And I think that that's what that is, right? You see that and you feel something. It's just like when I said I opened up the book and I felt like I started to cry, because you feel something. And I think that's the power in which, you guys were able to communicate his story in such a way that when you read this, you cannot not feel some of the stuff that's actually happening. And I think that that's the power of comics, because we can feel those things.
And Joel, speaking of, feeling, how do you feel March is relevant to today, to this past summer and now? And then this question is also for you, Nate and Andrew as well.
This, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, like the simple answer is yes, right? That's the simplest answer. The more complicated answer is that, in this country, we have been in a constant battle against racist ideas and white supremacy. And America has a problem with racism like alcoholics have a problem with alcoholism. Unless you stand up and say, we have a problem, you're never going to fix it. And there are lots of people here who talk about that problem being in the past. And I think if you look at March and look at what happens in March, like this is your opportunity now, right? Like if you were that person that says, I would have been on the bridge to Selma, which I think the congressman was very famous about saying that everybody who said they were there, that bridge would have fallen over. Like if you were one of those people that says you would have been there, like now is your time to be there. Like put a mask on, get a sign, and go do something. Go stand somewhere. I live in White Conda, which is in New Hampshire. It's 99% white. And there were Black Lives Matter marches here. And like we went, like me and my daughter went, and I spoke at one. So like this is your opportunity. And I think that this is what I feel like March in a lot of ways is like a call to action, right? This is the thing that you're looking at in history, and you're saying you would have been there, you would have been those people. Well, now's your opportunity. Be those people. And I think that that's like what I'm saying before is about, like, I don't know how to tell you to care about other people, because people care about it. That's what you have to do. Like I could, I'm honest. Like I'm living in the middle of nowhere. Like I have means, we have, like I could stay here and I'm not really worried about other people. Like I'm in a different tax bracket, but I care about other people. So I can't just let it go. And I think that this is the kind of book, this book is what this book has done is a call to action.
And I guess Nate, how do you feel this this book resonates with today?
I could not have said that more perfectly than Joel, in terms of like for people saying like, I would have been there, I would have done this, I would have been a part of that. This is that time. Show us. I want to kick it on over to Andrew, because I think you missed a bit here on that last round. So floor is yours.
Oh, I love you, Nate. I think, first of all, Joel, that was absolutely perfect. I love that you brought up that story about the congressman and everybody being at Selma, because we see a lot of revisionist history with people saying they supported an idea, they were there for it. I mean, we encounter this all the time, and I think this moment that we're in right now, there's two dangers, right? There's one that you'll be agnostic and you'll sit this out, and we'll let this moment of potential change pass us by. And then there's also the fact that the generation that's coming of age right now and coming through schools, they face such systemic inequality, both by racial means and also financial means. I mean, these kids are coming out of school burdened with an incredible amount of student debt, unaffordable housing, low wages. Like, if they want to find a way out of this, we need to teach them nonviolence, because otherwise they're going to become violent. I mean, we wonder what happens when nonviolent civil disobedience is cast aside. We saw that in the late 1960s. We saw that after the congressman left SNCC, and what happened when they took up violence, and they couldn't get the legislation through, and it ended up allowing then for a whole Nixonian style of politics to be brought to Washington. And I think now we're seeing that again in DC from apathy voting in 2016. And I think we've got to do everything in our power to educate ourselves about how we got here, and educate the next generation on how they can get us out of it.
I want to clap.
And you know, and we have the slide up of voting, and you know, it goes without saying that this upcoming presidential election is probably one of the most consequential, even though we say that about every election, but probably, you know, one of the most consequential in recent memory. And Nate, I know that, you know, toward the end of the congressman's life, you talking about, you know, light topics, but do any of you have any recollection of, you know, the last conversation you had with Representative Lewis about, you know, the state of affairs in America, and, you know, the, I guess, the current president, and how America has fared under his leadership?
My strongest memory was a very simple statement, which on its face sounds like it's not saying much, but when he uttered this, just sort of discussing the state of affairs, this would have been, you know, in the spring or in the late spring. But when you hear John Lewis say that he has never seen things like this in terms of whether it's congressional or government dysfunction, whether it's rampant rise of organized white supremacy, whether it's blending power and force. When John Lewis says he's never seen anything like this, you do well to listen to that. What about you, Andrew?
I mean, I think I think John Lewis was so conflicted at the end. He was just torn between cynicism and optimism, but he was such an optimistic person. I mean, Nate's right. I mean, he said that a number of times, like he'd never seen it like this. And I think when he saw the young people, I mean, you got to put it in context, right? The last speech he ever did on stage was with Nate and I, actually, in New York City, talking to school kids, right? Because he was so invested in teaching these young people how to stand up for themselves and how to stand up for us, because he saw that as the only viable future, the only way for us to survive and redeem the soul of America, as he would say. And then you saw it again when he goes back to Black Lives Matter Square, which is always amazing to me because it looks just like the cover to March Book 3. Someone pointed this out to me, and it was like it was the exact same iconography of putting the text on the road and then seeing it from above, and the imagery and the power. And I think about that a lot, where you know, people didn't always understand what it was he was trying to accomplish, or why he was doing some of the things. People didn't understand that with March when he started, but he always had his eye on this bigger prize of the long game. And that, you know, just just because they passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965 doesn't mean you can let up. And in fact, he has to fight to defend it then 50 years later. And that's the game we're playing. And it's not a game, that this is a battle for survival. And
I will interject that, especially like, coming as a newcomer in comparison to your relationship with the congressman, the fact that 3 weeks before March Book 1 came out was when the Supreme Court gutted the core of the Voting Rights Act, and having Andrew and Congressman kind of really lay out the stakes, really set a tone for what our mission was, for the work we were doing in comics, being a living thing, being a contribution to the world that was outside of strictly encapsulating a memoir or history. But the tone was really set from the get-go, and like the stakes, like Congressman Lewis's ability to convey both the personal and the worldly aspects of his experiences and struggles was made very clear from the get-go.
And the book also opens up, well, the first book opens up, and we sort of have this juxtaposition of Representative Lewis, young in age, protesting, and then you turn the page and he's waking up on the morning of the inauguration of President Obama. Did he talk about how, I guess I maybe this is not the right term, but the arc of his life of how or describe anything about coming full circle, or was he more pragmatic about this is a step, but there are a lot of steps to go? And sorry if this is sort of a meandering question, but hoping somebody could answer it.
No, I think what you're trying to get at is the context of Barack Obama being elected president and his inauguration and that choice, and that cathartic moment in some ways for the country, this pent up lack of representation we'd seen in the presidency, right? I think the congressman looked at it as his quote was always that he saw it not as a fulfillment of Dr. King's dream, but as a down payment, or a major down payment. And I think when you look at that scene that you're talking about, where it goes from Bloody Sunday to the very, very beginning of his day on Inauguration Day, there's another element in this that we thought about as we were constructing it, but I don't think we ever realized how relevant it would be, which is to also show that what makes America strong is the peaceful transfer of power, that we all believe in the institutions and we follow our systems and we follow our laws. And I think now, with everything going on and the inevitable tension that's going to happen on Election Day and afterwards, I think we at the time were taking for granted almost that peaceful transfer of power. And I think that, obviously, we don't have that cutscene where you go to Mitch McConnell and everybody else like up in another room in the Capitol being like, how do we make him a one-term president, right? But that is always looming over the story, right? And that's, I think, why you juxtapose. I mean, I remember, like, to be honest, that first 10-page sequence, I had just pitched our publisher over the table at a Comic-Con in 2010. It was actually at MoCA in New York, when they used to hold it at the old Armory. And I got home and or I got back to my friend's place where I was staying on his couch, and I was like so excited that a publisher had said yes. I mean, I've been rejected, I for years at this point, and it was really incredible. And I was excited, and I was like, we got to celebrate. My buddy was like, no, you got to sit down and work. This is too important. And so I called the congressman, I talked it through, and I'd had this idea of doing the flashback, because you always drop people into the action, and then being able to show that violence that is constantly in his mind that he experienced, juxtaposed with the peacefulness of the transfer of power, and which just as much, if not more, on a fantastic level, the presidency's powers being now transferred to the first African-American president. There was so much emotion in that moment. But you have to look at it in the in the moment of its creation, which is that tension and conflict and diametric opposition of the two scenes was at the forefront of everything we were trying to do when we created it, and that's why it was the first thing we wrote.
And also, it's important to recognize that, like, Andrew, you were there that day, and you're in the background of some of these pages during those 2009 scenes. But to recognize that in the way that this functions as memoir and history is that these 2009 scenes as a framing device also, I mean, this is truly a window into John Lewis's subjective experiences, which are kind of mind-bending at times. Like, over the years, it is very plain to us that when John Lewis talks about, being moved by the spirit of history, there's a component of like interdimensional thinking and like traveling in between times. Like, he really is reflecting upon the long arc of history in a lot of these moments in which he is moved powerfully. It affects him, it affects him emotionally and personally. But on Inauguration Day 2009, one reason why Andrew felt those scenes needed to be included was because of the sheer privilege of actually getting to view it in some way from John Lewis's perspective himself, like not only as a function of time related to progress, but physically being in a location where you're at the back steps of the US Capitol and you're able to gaze out upon the Lincoln Memorial on the other side, where physical distance is doubling as a function of time in context for this movement itself. And John Lewis very plainly experienced a lot of stuff in a powerful kind of like time travel-y way. It's really hard to explain, but his level of intensity was unique and powerful. And sometimes he'd get in there for a while and you're like, oh, something's happening here. And sometimes he would open up and he'd kind of give you a mini tour or reflect on things for a bit, and just like made the hair stand up on the back of your neck.
And this question might come out of left field, but I feel like it doesn't. But did the congressman ever share with you his favorite comic hero, his favorite superhero, or if he had a superpower, what would it be? Any insight into that?
I think the congressman, it's been funny because to reference you guys' earlier comments about reading on Wikipedia and how these stories change over time. The congressman, really the only comic book he'd ever read before I started talking to him about comics was Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And he would be so sweet when people would ask him like, oh, are you a comics fan? And now like everybody's like, comic fan, John Lewis. And you're like, okay, sure. But the truth is, he would always defer the question. He'd be like, well, I used to read the comics in the back of my grandfather's newspaper because that was what he had. I mean, 10 cents for a comic at the time was probably extravagant. And they just weren't around. It just wasn't something he was ever exposed to. But the funny thing is when he went to Comic-Con and he had no idea who the characters were. So like, I remember introducing him to Lou Ferrigno, and he's like, oh, I've heard of the Hulk, and he's like having this moment of recognizing who that was and figuring it out. But then it was always a fun game when we would be walking around because he would like to go and see everybody, right? And he would ask like, who's that? He'd be like, oh, sir, that's Wolverine. And then, and then sometimes like he'd make this like, I shouldn't say this, but he'd make a comment, he'd be like, she's dressed for warm weather. Be like, oh yeah, that's from The Fifth Element, sir. I'm sorry. Yeah. And it's like this culture clash, but he was so game for it. I mean, and you got to remember too, like he was so curious about the culture. When we first started talking about the idea, before we ever had a publisher, before we ever had anything, I would go to Dragon Con every year. And he the first time I went, that was the year after the campaign, and everybody made fun of me for that. And so it was sort of, it wasn't, talked about, everybody was tired. And then the next year, he asked me, "Are you going to Dragon Con again?" I was like, "Of course, sir. I go just about every year." And he's like, "Would you like to have lunch?" Because it's held just down the street from his office. And so on the Saturday of Dragon Con, he and his son, John Miles, meet me at the Hyatt. And we sit in the lobby of the Hyatt as Dragon Con starts to come together. And if you've ever been in the lobby of the Hyatt during Dragon Con, it is what the Congressman would call it a happening, right? I mean, everybody in costume comes and they hang out and they take pictures, and it's,
it's the cosplay con too.
Absolutely. And he was, I'll never forget him just kind of looking out, like he didn't eat his lunch. Like it was just, what is that? And then I'd ask him, like, were you okay? Like, I asked him later, like, were you okay with that? Was that like, he was like, "I've never seen anything like that in my life." And then he was like fascinated by it, right? And then fast forward 4 years for him to go to San Diego Comic-Con, first congressman ever to go. Like, this was, a lot of people didn't think it was a good idea for him to go. And we're like, no, this is what you do. This is how you promote a comic book. And he was excited, and he shows up and he walks through, and it became something that he really enjoyed. And then when I would go to Comic-Con without him, he would get jealous.
Yeah.
Like a little pouty. And
this is one of his personality traits too. He keeps it like close to the chest, but yeah, he'd get a little jealous and pouty sometimes. He'll let it out in little ways. He's like, "What are you guys doing? Oh, it sounds like fun."
And going back earlier to what you said, Andrew, about the only comic book Representative Lewis coming across were the comics in the back of his granddad's magazines. And I guess I'll turn that question to Joel. I guess, what do you think that says about the significance of comic books, that the first interaction, or the only interaction Congressman Lewis had with comics, was sort of like this civil rights kind of medium?
I mean, comics have the power to, I talk about comics having the power to create empathy, and it's through these images that people build empathy. And I think telling these stories and being exposed to these stories, I mean, that's how everybody is exposed to comics in the beginning, right? Not everybody gets like an entire comic. It's like the newspaper, because it's cheap. It's probably in the grocery store or somewhere, like somebody's got it, so everybody's going to be exposed to it. And I think the comics having that ability to tell these broader stories is like indicative of what this comic was able to do. And if I'm not mistaken, Andrew, like this was Dr. King and the Montgomery story was like one of that was one of your inspirations for doing this, right? Like this was what you were trying to do in the first place, right?
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up, because when the congressman told me about Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, and I read this comic and he says it's played its important role in the civil rights movement, I kind of developed a pretty significant obsession with its history. I actually went on to write my graduate thesis on its history, and it was sort of the first time anybody like really done the deep dive. And through that thesis, actually, but we found that the way it worked was that Jim Lawson, Dr. King, others, mostly folks affiliated with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, had used it as part of a broader campaign. So they called it a reconciliation tour. And they took the comic around to different churches and schools where they could get meeting space, and they led nonviolence workshops, and they gave out the comic after it was over. And that takeaway then became the inspiration for a number of students who read the comic, passed it around, and ended up, I mean, you could look at 1958, there were some Tulsa sit-ins before the sit-in movement that Lawson mentions as like having been directly inspired by these workshops. but the idea of not just putting together the comic, but having to barnstorm with it and go give talks. I mean, we were joking before this started about how many events we've done over the years, but that was as much a part of this endeavor as the books itself, because then it allowed John Lewis to go and speak to thousands and thousands of students at libraries and at schools and major universities all over the country and have the same conversation just like his mentors had in 1957 and 58 and 59. And in a sense, we were picking up that baton. And I think that's also what was so extraordinary about John Lewis, is that he invited Nate and I along on that. It wasn't just that John Lewis, who had earned the stage, kept it all to himself. It was just like his mentor had done, where it was Lawson and so many others all sharing the stage and going out and spreading the gospel, spreading the good word. And for us, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, and the way they told the story, the history of it, but then how they got it out into the world, that was both elements of that were our guide and our inspiration.
And I think, we're getting close to our ending time. So, I mean, I don't have any more questions for you all, but I was wondering, I guess, is now the time we can open it up to maybe people viewing, if they have any questions.
Yeah, we have some posted to Crowdcast. So someone wants to know, Andrew, what graphic novels did you show to Congressman Lewis to convince him that it was a good medium for this story?
That's a great question. So it was sort of the usual suspects, plus this like burgeoning small group of creators that had been telling Black stories in comics that were at the time sort of revolutionary. Start with Mouse, Persepolis, Fun Home, right? The pinnacle. And then the other that I really leaned heavily on was showing him Matt Johnson's Incognito. And how that was, even though it was fictionalized, it was still a nonfiction-esque story, and got him a copy of that. The other was actually, and this one he thought was a little trippy. It was Pride of Baghdad by Brian K. Vaughan, which I had just been a huge fan of, and actually I remember I gave it to my first boss for Christmas, the Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut, and I think he thought I was a little nuts giving him a comic book, but then he ultimately read it and he liked it. Wow. So those are really the ones that we looked at the beginning as a model, and I think it also shows in the way we told the story. Having the framing device to tell the larger picture is very Mouse-esque, and then in some ways, as I was writing it, I looked at it as I was in Spiegelman's shoes and talking to my dad, who was John Lewis, and so that's why you see me very briefly in certain parts of the book.
Wonderful. Did Congressman Lewis push back on any pages, and if so, which ones and why?
Well, we were in constant touch, so like a lot of it is us deferring regularly for fishing for further details or clarification, or going back with our own fact checking and reference and research, and then trying to make these subjective and historically accepted accounts mix. The example I can think of best, which I think really helped define the shift that was occurring from book to book, had to do with the cover of book 2 itself. So, this is split into two, and we've got the March on Washington with John Lewis speaking at the bottom, and on the top here, we have what would have been John Lewis's bus on the Freedom Rides being attacked by a white supremacist mob and burned just outside of Anniston, Alabama. So back in February 2014, I did this cover, and we were all looped in every day. We all signed off on it. We were all real happy with it. And then I think in early June, the congressman was like, hold on, let's put the brakes. I've been thinking about something quietly for a while, and I'm not comfortable with this cover. I'm not comfortable with the bus half of it because I was not there. And we're like, okay, well, let's see what else we can work out. To make a long story short, I did a new top half that was fine. And, we all signed off on it. It was good. But basically his pushback there, having to do with voice and authorship and responsibility, not from our end having to kind of navigate this tricky middle ground with him and for him, but his sense of authorship and voice in the fact that in this moment, he felt was not his story to tell from a memoir perspective. It forced us into this larger conversation about what is the story within March becoming. Like we lucked out that March Book 1, like the media documentation of these historical events in Nashville were relatively very low. So we were able to rely a lot on John Lewis's subjective first-person memories and accounts. This gave us a lot of wiggle room to really just make this work in a lot of ways like a standard graphic novel. However, the history of the civil rights movement simply has to do with the movement itself necessarily exploding past a point in which even a central figure has the ability to be present for everything. That's central to the history and thus central to the way we're approaching the narrative. And so once it sort of took that pushback before we all recognized that that component was kind of out of our hands. And once we accepted that, then Congressman Lewis was like, all right, okay, on board. And that sort of, I feel like that really moved us into the next step of our collaborative relationship. Like we had developed a new framework by which we were approaching this history all together, but simply by accepting this as a central image that was not experienced firsthand by the congressman himself.
Well, and to piggyback on that, if you could hold up, I don't have book 3 in front of me, but
Gotcha.
we also went through that same process with book 3 because of the guy in the white jacket.
Sweater guy,
right? Who's a real person. And the congressman was so conscious of who and where they're depicted on the cover so that it was authentic. That, you know, we're getting into the aerial shots and all these different things to be able to pick out these individuals who were in that line. And that was, if anything, that he pushed back on. It was the idea that, you know, that it was true, that he was there, or it was as accurate as possible, and that it was just real and made it plain. And that was what he was concerned about. And there was never a moment where it was something that we were concerned about, because we were in such close communication that whole time. But it was some vigorous discussion. I mean, I remember, I still have it, actually. I came across it the other day, is the proof, the cover proof of book 2 that you guys, because sometimes I had to be the messenger, right? So John Lewis would tell me something, and then I'd be like, guys, I have bad news, and they'd be like, it's all your fault, you know. And so I had to get him to sign that cover proof and then scan it and send it to everybody, being like, okay, he can't back out now,
right?
You know, like the decision is made. And that was John Lewis, you know.
I think we have time for just one more. So
Can I just thank y'all for letting me be a part of this? Just FYI, like,
absolutely.
This, like, I'm just like looking at, like, knowing you guys and like watching this. Just, I'm like, I feel honored just to be here. So,
Joel, we should do
like,
this more, man. It's good for you to be here.
Yes, you're a part of the family, Joel.
Yeah, and I still don't think I've forgotten about that idea we had at SPX in 2012. Don't tell everybody here, because it's still a good idea.
I was about to say it too, but you said that. I'm not gonna say it now.
Well, this is particularly to what you all are doing next. I'm curious if when will we see the sequel to March run, which has been announced, and if so, when can we expect it? And was the script completed before his passing? I'm also curious if you're going to be resuming your roles on it. But yeah, we'd love to hear what you guys are doing next, including Joel.
Here, I'll just show you the book. There it is. You can read it real quick. How's that? You got it?
It exists.
It exists. Yeah, I mean, I can't say like a date and all that sort of stuff, because that's going to come from the publisher. But there it is. And you know, the congressman and I had actually gotten through about 2 books worth of script, and you know, there's always tweaks at the end that you have to make, and in some ways it's been really lonely to have to do that work without him, because part of the fun when you get to that part of the book is how excited he would get and how much he loved that part of the process. And yeah, it's coming. Just give us a little bit of time. We'll make an announcement, and we're glad that everybody's looking forward to it. And I think we're really excited because we built a great team around making this a sustainable process that we can keep going. We can keep telling John Lewis's story, and hopefully we can all team together and tell other stories that intersect and highlight other people who deserve to have their story elevated, just like John Lewis's was.
Nate, you want to tell everybody what you're doing next?
Sure. Besides, you know, finally not being able to hold back my tears through this panel. But, I've been doing a good job though. Yeah, I just finished a book called Save It for Later, which will be coming out in April from Abrams. And it's a memoir essay hybrid that basically has to do with my and my family's account of living through the last 5 years, but a lot of it relates to contextualizing what's happening on the ground, in the streets, in the halls of government, but also on the pages of my work as my kids grow and as their worldview expands, and sort of equipping everyone, not only equipping kids with what they need to be able to tackle an increasingly ominous, authoritarian, you know, set of challenges in our society and across the world, but also sort of swinging back against this conventional wisdom that we're all kind of in a crisis state, and we have been for years. But very quickly, one of the first casualties there was people's sense that it was valid to reflect on any of the quieter personal moments of doubt, terror, anxiety. I think a lot of us had the sense that, like, that's not important because it's not, you know, it's not concrete. It doesn't have relevance in the means of starting or stopping what's happening. And so a lot of that just started with being mindful and paying attention to these moments of terror, moments of hope, and watching over the course of the last 5 years as my, you know, 4-year-old has turned into an almost 9-year-old, and seeing how her worldview has changed, and how my relationship to working with Andrew and Congressman Lewis has translated as a parent, and how that work has also translated for me back into the streets.
It's a fantastic book. Like, I just can't, like, it's great. I read it. It's fantastic. It's really great. I am working on Stamped from the Beginning, the definitive history of racist idea with Ibram Kendi, which is, if you haven't read it, go read it. It's I'm turning a 589-page history tome into a 250-page graphic novel. So that's my all day, every day. So that's what I'm working on.
Thank you all. Thank you, Quincy, Nate, Joel, and Andrew. And thank you all for coming. To order March from Paper Asylum, a local independent comic shop, please find a link to their website by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. This session is part of the month of Mice, a month of free comics programs, including panel discussions and workshops. We have our final week of Mice coming up last weekend, so you may want to check out our co-presentation with Comics in Color called Black Imagination, Afrofuturism, and Afrofantasy this Saturday at 4 p.m. For a full list of sessions, visit micexpo.org and check out our fundraising raffle, where you could win cool prizes like a tote bag full of books from Drawn Quarterly and a Wacom One tablet. Again, thank you all for coming, and have a great night.